Hey, 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 welcome back. We're in the fifth lecture for chapter 12. We're going to look at how T cells fight the pathogens because we've already looked at how B cells are activated and how they fight. So now let's look at the T cell activation. So like B cells, T cells have to be immunocompetent. And so again, immunocompetence means they recognize foreign antigens and they will bind to those foreign antigens, but they do not get activated by self-antigens. They are self-tolerant. But T cells can't bind to antigens directly. T cells have to bind to cells, so self cells, that have been infected with or have a foreign antigen presented. And so there are different ways that we can present antigens. But the main cells that can present antigens really easy are called antigen presenting cells. And they process the antigen and then they present it on the surface of their cell with self protein. So it's like a self, non-self complex that sits on the surface of the cell. So we have different types of T cells. We have helper T cells. These are cells that don't fight, but they activate other either non-specific defenses or other specific defenses, including activating T cells, cytotoxic T cells. We have cytotoxic T cells, which are your fighters of the T lymphocyte immunity. We have regulatory T cells that help to maintain all the T cells and make sure everything is working properly. And then we have memory T cells. So T cells recognize non-self and self through a process called antigen presentation. A non-self antigen has to be presented with a self antigen on the surface of the cell. So here you have an antigen. Here we have the antigen has been broken apart. And so we take a piece of that antigen and we put it on a self protein, and then we present that self protein with the non-self, and then that allows the helper cell to attach. It binds and it recognizes that non-self with the self and it gets activated. And this stimulates both B cells and T cells to get activated, as well as it stimulates non-specific defenses. So helper T cells are like the generals in an army, if you want to think of it that way. They're the ones telling everybody else what they have to do, and without that general, then the army would just fall apart. So think of it that way. So what are cytotoxic T cells? These are the cells that kill other self cells that are infected. What they do is they bind to that self non-self complex and they release chemicals, perforins, that break open the the infected cell, and then they can release granzymes that are going to cause the cell to lysis, or not lysis, I'm sorry, to undergo apoptosis. Once this happens, they then release from the cell and they look for other targets. So here we have a cytotoxic T cell. It binds to the surface of a self cell that has non-self associated with it. So you can see that. As soon as that happens, the helper T cell or the cytotoxic T cell releases perforins. Perforins cause little holes to be formed within that cell's plasma membrane, and then they release granzymes that go into the cell. The granzymes are then able to cause the DNA and the cell inside, the structures of the cell to start undergoing apoptosis. Whereas the perforins allow for more materials to enter the cell, which can cause the cell to lysis open as well. And then the T cell can move on to another cell that also is infected. So helper T cells are the cells that basically run the entire non-specific and specific defense mechanisms. So they recruit cells to fight. They interact with B cells. They release cytokines to stimulate more B cells. They release cytokines to stimulate T cells. They release cytokines that stimulate the inflammatory response, stimulate the interferon activity if needed, fever, and they activate cell, or they stimulate other cells to come to the area where the fight is occurring. So they do a lot of work. We have regulatory T cells that release chemicals to suppress B and T cells so that we don't keep fighting, especially if we have won the war already. So then we can kind of slow down the activity of B and T cells. So they regulate those cells and maintain the activity of your immune system. And so this is a beautiful figure that shows both humoral and cell-mediated immune response. So here we have the first activation or first exposure to an antigen. In this case, we have a macrophage that engulfs the antigen. The antigen is then expressed by the antigen presenting cell, which is the macrophage. Helper T cell gets stimulated by the antigen presenting cell, and it releases chemicals to stimulate B cell activity. We also have free antigens that stimulate B cell activity. The B cells then are going to proliferate and differentiate into plasma cells and memory B cells. Plasma cells secrete antibodies. Over here, helper T cell stimulates cytotoxic T cells. The antigens displayed on self cells are also going to stimulate cytotoxic T cells. The cytotoxic T cells then are going to get activated. They're going to proliferate and differentiate into either activated cytotoxic T cells that secrete chemicals to kill the cells that are infected, and then we have memory cells. So the memory T cells then remember the pathogen, and the second exposure immediately elicits a response where we produce thousands of clones of plasma cells and cytotoxic T cells, as well as new memory cells, and we fight off the infection before the infection can even cause any symptoms. And so here we can have the different, here this is just table 12.3 that shows the different cell types involved in specific and non-specific immunity. Cytokines that do all kinds of things. Cytokines are not cells. These are chemicals released by cells. These are more chemicals. And then there's the antigen. So at this point, you can answer how are T cells activated, what are cytotoxic T cells, what are helper T cells, what are memory T cells, and what are regulatory T cells. Hold on.